All right, we're gonna get started. If you're out in the hall, don't be out in the hall. Come back in. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you've made it to the best part of the evening.
Jesse.
See that? Good on you. So I'm Kim Herb, I'm with Business Oregon, and none of you are here to hear me talk, so I'm going to introduce the folks that we've got. You've seen all of them, or they've all presented a little bit here today. This is an opportunity for us to hear a little bit more, have them engage, have them learn from each other, and share those insights with us, so I'm really excited. Who we've got here, we've got Jesse Keenan, again, back from this morning's session, so you can grill him a little bit more about adaptation and resiliency and trade-offs. We've got Jeff Raker coming in from Metro. You probably saw him down in the lightning sessions. And then we've got Reese, who you saw this afternoon while you were eating your delicious salads and sandwiches. So welcome them all back to the stage. And then Lorelei, here back from Echo Northwest to help moderate this conversation. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way and pass it off to them.
Thank you for following all those social norms on when you're supposed to clap. And thank you so much for being here for the plenary. I'm really looking forward to this discussion and to having an opportunity to engage with some of the topics that you all have been hearing about over the course of the last couple of days. The order of service promised that this would be a spirited discussion. And I somehow thought that meant I would get to have a martini, but it turns out that's not true for me or for anyone else here. So thank you, that would be great. I would very much appreciate it. But we will try to make it a little bit less like the kinds of sessions that you've been hearing with presentation followed by discussion and answer and more discussion oriented among the group here. So y'all should engage with each other and feel free to ask each other questions, and we'll see where all of this goes. Our overall purpose is to try to pull out some of the themes that have been prevalent through the summit over the course of the last couple of days so that we can leave you with some thoughts about the most important kinds of topics to be contemplating as we all go back into our normal working lives, but also to set up for the summit that will be happening next year and to try to explore some of the topics that might deserve more attention in the future. So to kick this off, we have a lot of questions to get through up here, and I want to make sure that we have time to get to them all. And to kick them off, I want to try a little bit of a lightning round where you each can have maybe 2-3 minutes tops to give us your best elevator pitch for adaptive and resilient infrastructure. What is it? What does it look like on the ground? Why do we want it? And be as convincing as you can be. I'm gonna start here with Jesse.
Well, I think one of the core intents of thinking about adaptive infrastructure and adaptive capacity, and I'm going to leave resilience aside because I think that that's a somewhat different category, but I think there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and there's an irreducible amount of uncertainty in a dynamic climate, particularly one that's moving very quickly. And where we invest and disinvest requires, it's not about cost optimization. It's really about accommodating a variety of different interests. And sometimes it's about buying time. Sometimes we don't have that luxury of buying time. And what can we do, particularly, and I think this is a particularly interesting area in engineered systems and just engineered material outcomes, is how can we design adaptive capacity? And I'll give you an example of this. We've been working for a number of years on a multi-layer flood defense system in Manhattan. And this has a certain kind of resilience engineering functionality associated with, based on a kind of probability return period for surge, flooding, et cetera, kind of known quotients of parameters of performance. But there is, a little less than 10% probability of a rapid ice melt scenario, of which this infrastructure would be largely obsolete. And I'm just using these kind of numbers as a shorthand and a heuristic for it. So the question is, how do we design something that has the accretive material capacity for greater pumps, for greater performance? And how much are we willing to spend up to what threshold to over-invest in this particular infrastructure, given this chance of a rapid ice melt scenario? And so that's just one of many examples. We're thinking about adaptive capacity, and it's not really about optimization as we currently understand it, right? And that's why you often hear the language of redundancy sometimes paired in this conversation. I think in the course of this, and this will be my last point, we can't expect these things to necessarily make economic returns, right? And I think when we come to terms with the proposition that indeed there are negative discount rates, and that we really just have to throw money at problems in the interest of the public good, and that may not necessarily return something in the way that we necessarily have oriented it in terms of monetized values, which was very clearly presented earlier. And that's a challenge going forward. That challenges our institutions, and it challenges our reporting and disclosure and everything else that falls in line. But it requires a fundamental rethinking of what is the true value of what we have and what we could have.
I think that last point is particularly important. I had a chance to chat with a few of you about what questions you thought needed to be brought forward, and that last point that you made about the where does the money come from and how do we prioritize short-term investments that we know may not actually return anything until the long term, and even then it's uncertain whether it will, was a topic that I heard from you all that you wanted to hear more about. So we'll make sure we come back to that in the discussion. But let's continue our elevator pitches. Why adaptive and resilient? What is it? What does it look like?
I think a point of frustration is that our existing tools for evaluating the outcomes from a particular infrastructure project are kind of ineffective. If we were to truly be designing these systems, we would design them as other systems in nature might be more adaptive or resilient to change. And that would involve, obviously, layers of different forms of infrastructure, redundancy and context sensitivity, and it being sort of multifunctional as well, and supporting all those different perspective needs. But our tools, really don't exist. So I think what we need to do is try to understand those disruptions that we might expect coming out and sort of outline the response that we might have to a different level and form of impact from a particular disruption, like e-commerce or automation, or the significant income income disparities, as well as demographic shifts. But what I wanted to also say that this is not a resilient system unless it really is grounded in authentic partnerships and it's celebrated by the broader community. And I don't mean that we do our minimum 30-day, 60-day environmental impact statement commentary, but that we have an honest articulation of trade-offs, in some cases portraying the actual negative impacts of the infrastructure proposals that we have, alongside the clear benefits. Some examples of this are in the Southwest Corridor. We elevated a business that was going to Southwest Corridor light rail in the Portland region. Sorry, we elevated a business that would likely have faced displacement and discussed their emotional situation going through that potential displacement associated with the rail. But then we elevated that alongside with the other voices saying, well, we do have these other travel options that are expanding for somebody that's wheelchair bound, or a household that's wheelchair bound. So, portraying honestly what the trade-offs are and the impacts and benefits are from our infrastructure investments is part of this. We're doing a lot of that in the form of reliance on trusted community-based organizations that can lift up those voices that otherwise might not be heard. We're experimenting quite a bit with projects where in that particular light rail corridor, we've worked with OHSU and ERCO to take incumbent workers at OHSU that might be working in food service or maintenance and trying to get them onto a medical career pathway. We've advanced efforts to look at business support mechanisms and lending alongside all of the affordable housing initiatives. And so it's this essential kind of outreach, but not just outreach, but engagement, empowerment, of the communities that are going to be impacted that will inform our projects and allow them to be celebrated, and so then they will be stewarded and maintained over the long term.
Can I add a point to that?
Sure.
And I completely agree with you. I think some of the experience that we've had in the United States and other places in the world that has taken on that modes of participatory engagement, but really a measure of authenticity about building trust in the legitimacy and the idea of what the project's going to do. It's really interesting. There's been a kind of mixed bag of experience with that because like any kind of mobilization of people, you fundamentally have to deliver. And if you don't deliver, you lose a little bit of faith in what the resilience has been. And I think there's so much rhetoric behind resilience and what it really represents and what it doesn't. And I think you nailed it in terms of the trade-offs. But I think it's worth really remembering that we've perpetuated this idea of resilient and resilience. Resilience and adaptation are processes. They're not outcomes. And when we oversell what is resilient, we're overselling what these things can and cannot really fundamentally do. And what's really interesting, when you look at environmental justice groups and communities and climate justice, and by the way, there is a big difference you see now, somewhat factionalized between climate justice and environmental justice in the United States. And there's an interesting kind of legacy to this and how and why. I think unnecessary, but it is. A lot of people say, you know what, we're tired of being called resilient. Because resilience doesn't necessitate challenging the underlying institutional mechanisms that have defined our vulnerability in the first place. We want to be adaptive. We actually don't want to be resilient. And so I think you're seeing a somewhat counter narrative among different communities have been saying, oh, you personally are narrative. It's the liberalized identity associated with resilience as we have oversold it. So I think in many ways, I fully agree with you. I fully agree with the trade-offs. That's a way to rhetorically limit and delimit what you need to do to communicate in an honest way with people. But I think we should reflect fundamentally on what all this really means, because it is interpreted and it has largely, I think, been oversold in the power of what it represents.
Though I think part of the point that Jeff was trying to make is that it's a question of for whom are we planning and who are we engaging in the conversation, in addition to the terminology between resilience and adaptive, which is a very important distinction that you made.
And it is, and it speaks to both the procedural justice and the distributive equity of who's really benefiting to what and for whom.
Okay, lightning round's not going so fast. Reese? This is perfect, though.
Well, knowing that I was going to be in a panel with guys that are way smarter than me about this, and an audience that is probably way smarter than me on this, over dinner last night, I had the pleasure of dining with someone who I consider, well, I can't call him the Oregon's doctor of resilience because he works at University of Oregon, and the PhDs get very sensitive if anybody calls anybody a doctor who isn't a PhD. So I'll call him either the Prince of Resilience or the Swami or the Czar of Resilience. But Josh Bruce so I asked him this question: what does he consider the definition? And I'm probably going to botch it, but basically, the legacy systems that we built in terms of the physical systems, the physical infrastructure over the last century tend to be kind of centralized, unidirectional, managed by I don't know about a priesthood, but people, technical experts in the know, and the community goes about their business and doesn't pay too much attention to it, and they fix it and keep it working. And but those systems tend to be brittle and gray, and if there's a disaster or a disruption, they can be prone to going down in a big way, and large swaths of people are out. If with the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, like people could be out of water in 3 million people or something to that effect in the Puget Sound area for a month, which is kind of a staggering thought. So adaptive or resilient systems from that standpoint might be more flexible, more distributed, more of a microgrid model where one piece of the geography could go down and, the other 5/6 would still be operating. So that could be one way to think about it. I think it's probably locally specific. Communities on the east side, obviously, are very different, face different hazards than communities on the west side. Just the environmental factors are very different in every community. The social dynamics, the local economy, it's got to be very much tailored. And to some extent, I think, to the extent that you can engage the community in understanding how we can be adaptive and how our infrastructure can adapt, that can be good. It's a little scary for the infrastructure providers to involve their constituents in the community in kind of decision making around infrastructure because they're not used to that, but there's new skill sets for community engagement that are emerging that can raise the comfort level. Anyway, so there's a couple lightning reflections.
Fantastic. Let's draw out one of the themes that I think I heard you hitting on there, which is the fact that the infrastructure has to be designed and implemented in a way that makes sense for that specific geography. And I know that one of the things that the organizers of this summit were trying to do is make sure that the content was meaningful for people regardless of which community you have come from. So just by a quick show of hands, if you are here representing what you consider to be a rural community, let's see what that looks like. Yeah, lots of you. Okay, how about a suburban community? And then all the rest of you urban or NA? Yeah, fantastic. So I would like to draw on this a little bit to think about how adaptive and resilient infrastructure might look different in urban areas versus in rural areas and even in suburban areas, and how would it look different on the ground, and are the tools that those communities might use to plan for and implement adaptive and resilient solutions different in ways that are meaningful to the conversation? Who wants to go first? Jeff, do you want to go first? Take
Sure.
it from the metro perspective.
Yeah. Urban county, urban region. So, I mean, I want to focus more on what we actually share more than what divides us. But there's an understandable difference in that there is existing infrastructure that all of a sudden we have to disrupt in order to put in new infrastructure in urbanized areas. And that's not, not to say that it's not the case in rural areas, but it is more intensive within those urban environments. But I think more importantly, when we're making the decisions, we need to remember that there are statewide implications to the decisions in both contexts. And there's more in common on the outcomes that we need to get out of that infrastructure. Housing affordability is statewide. Issues of brownfield redevelopment, understanding supply chains in particular industries, like the food sector is a very easy example, but there's other examples like clean tech and then the logistics and transportation sector on its own as well. And I think there's sort of implications for infrastructure investment that have ripple effect in both communities. And so I don't want that division to be made as more to find out where is it that when we make an urban decision, we are impacting those rural areas and vice versa. I'm not an expert in it. But yeah, that's.
I love it. He rejects the notion of the question. Anybody else have a different perspective?
Well, I think what you highlight is the qualitative aspects at scale. And certainly there has been, at least in the past 20 years, primarily in Europe and Australia and other places, where a certain scale of infrastructure was co-aligned as a kind of public amenity, and thinking about the publicness and challenging the publicness of infrastructure in many ways as a mode of engagement. Even in place like thinking about Shelby County, Tennessee, and the National Disaster Resilience Competition, which is one of the counties we worked with. And they were able to really think about, a kind of room for the river plan, but they really got into the public health implications and actually thinking about community program. And all of a sudden it was a physical asset that became a programmatic asset in the sense that we have social infrastructure. And they internalized the idea of linking social infrastructure with material infrastructure, and they could quantify, or they attempted to quantify some measure in a triple bottom line cost benefit analysis of the public health benefits, of the value of children engaged in this now open plane of space and space for engagement and social, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's an important shift that is uniquely advantaged to urban concentrations of populations. How do we think about the co-development, the co-evolution of physical infrastructure and social infrastructure at the same time? And frankly, I think there's some pretty good models out there for doing that. It's not easy to do. It's intensive in terms of the program execution, but I think in many ways it's really getting the most out of the opportunity.
That's interesting notion. Reese?
I don't know if it's the inverse to that point, but it just seems like if, to the extent that building really smart, resilient, adaptive infrastructure systems is technically challenging, that these are complex systems, and you need pretty talented people, and you need some serious minds put to the test, and you need some resources to back it up. Urban areas are in a much better position to attract really great people because of the quality of life and all the assets of urban communities, and the resources that are available to, through government to invest in these systems. And as you move out to suburban and rural areas, it can be just the capacity, the resources available can be really constrained. The capacity, sometimes it's hard to keep, attract the next generation to stick around and not move to the cities. And so how do you build the critical mass of expertise and energy and resources to really think through how to build smart, resilient, adaptive infrastructure? Can be really challenging.
Yeah, and I heard several sessions that were focused on exactly that kind of a question of how do you make sure that you have the right people and the right sort of center of gravity to be able to implement a complicated solution to a problem. Fantastic.
There's been a lot of research on this for years, and they've generally over-intellectualized the problem. It actually just takes leadership, and it takes continuity of leadership that's willing to stick around for 10 years and 15 years, which we've seen here today. In fact, I've seen many examples since in the day and a half that I've been here. People have just stuck with it for 15 years, 10 years. That's the leadership, and that's I don't think it's really about, human capital, I get it, administrative capacity, administering these grants and funding solutions is not easy, it's not cheap, it has overhead. But at the end of the day, it's fundamentally about leadership.
And political will, right? If you don't have the ability to prioritize the funding for it, you're never going to be able to do anything.
That's right. Yeah. And that's part of leadership, is taking the downside of what it means to bear the costs of these things.
Yeah, whatever your position is on the housing measure that Metro passed recently, those communities that we were engaging in most and having these types of deeper relationships with, you saw an uptick in the voting, I think mostly just because we had a direct relationship with them more tightly than in other areas. And so when you make a major public investment, it's those key sort of interactions that you have more deep than I think in the past.
Yeah.
And there's really interesting research on this recovery. So they look at different types of social cohesion in different communities around the world and how they have recovered. And even this work has been exclusively done in the United States as well. And there's different metrics of how we can measure a community and different participation rate in community service and religious organizations, any number of things. There's lots of metrics. And they found that these correlations do exist, right? That communities have certain tangible and intangible aspects of cohesion that really do speak to the durability, particularly at least in a post-recovery context. And so it's quite resolute in that manner.
Feels like the leadership too, a really important aspect of it is galvanizing, the ability to galvanize people in your community around a positive vision for the future, and that can get people excited and that can draw people in and give people a reason to stay and invest their time, invest their lives into making something great happen in our community. And you see this obviously in John Day and other communities featured here. So I think that's a really important aspect of this too.
Though it is very hard to tell compelling stories about infrastructure, I've heard a fair amount of that happening here over the course of the last couple days, and to me that feels like a real ray of hope that by bringing everyone together in a setting like this to be able to talk about what works and to build momentum and to start to practice the narratives that will be necessary to build political will and to build the kind of social cohesion around these specific topics. It's pretty fun to see that. Okay, let's shift gears just a little bit because according to what's written in all of your playbills, we're supposed to be talking about disruptions. Not about what brings us all together, but about disruptions. So I'm curious from each of your perspectives, we've got national, state, local perspectives, what do you think are the biggest disruptive shifts that we here in Oregon should be expecting in the next 10 years, and then longer term beyond that? And ideas about what the outcomes or the implications of those shifts might be for all of our collective planning around infrastructure provision.
So I referenced this morning a paper that I just released or published a couple of weeks ago in Science that I think speaks to this point. There's two things that are working somewhat for and against you. One is the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is central banks of the world engaged in a process of greening and browning asset classes. It's, in my humble opinion, the most consequential governance entity in the world for addressing climate change, because it has the capacity to steer capital, and by browning assets and asset classes, moving capital away from those aspects that speak to an undermining of our GHG and carbon goals in terms of mitigating climate. But it will also speak to a full range of opportunities in terms of adaptation and resilience, and it will recalibrate risk pricing and risk taking as a stress testing or any other mechanism that we can understand of how you make investments in particularly in infrastructure classes. So it's going to be consequential because I think it's going to push money in the right direction. Now, the flip side of this is that as we see it now, I think we've seen it in the real estate market. And we're getting better and better information in the mortgage market. And certainly the insurance market is a massive laggard here. But there are certain market phenomenon which were going to dictate settlement patterns and investment in different neighborhoods, communities, that are really going to challenge the fiscal viability of some communities and their underlying tax base. I mean, we have real conversations about the inadequacy of public bankruptcy code, which is oriented towards reorganization, not liquidation. There's many governments, local governments in the United States that are going to be subject to state receivership sooner than later. We are wholly unprepared about what it's going to mean when we really reach fiscal insolvency for small communities and how we think about shifting populations in accordance to that. And markets are going and are at this very moment driving some of that much of that activity. And I think in many ways we're wholly unprepared with this set of mechanisms in place. There's an accounting rule, FISL, which is an acronym that I won't get into, that requires the upfront, at the time of origination of debt, requires a forward-looking credit loss. And what this essentially means is you have to discount the value, the mark-to-market value of a particular asset to incorporate its potential loss over the life cycle of that asset. So normally you only take a loss when you actually accrue the loss. But now we have to discount the book value of these certain types of instruments, including a good old-fashioned mortgage. And when this goes into place, it's going to force a recognition and a certain intelligence about what those full spectrum of prepayment risks are, credit losses, collateral losses, et cetera. And it's going, assuming we have some kind of yield maintenance, that is, people want to still make the same amount of money, it should have a pricing impact, and therefore should have some demand function in terms of price elasticities and purchasing power. And so when you start adding up these mechanisms, you see the top-down influences globally, you see the bottom-up activities to get better resolution and price discovery. We're wholly unprepared for this in terms of the impact on municipal and public finance in the United States.
I think what I interact with in terms of disruptions through Metro, well, Metro's outlining a update to their growth strategy over the next 50 years, and we're very much interested in what automation, so sort of those industrial disruptions like automation, the potential for potentially smaller scale manufacturing, there's retail disruptions with e-commerce. What is that going to do to our land use expectations? And so we are endeavoring in a body of work over the next few years that will be looking into that more intimately and trying to find out, okay, what does that mean based on our land use plan? We have outlined, where certain types of uses belong. Do those expectations changed based on those those disruptions that touch on both infrastructure and land use changes? And then the other primary one is obviously, I think I alluded to it earlier, but just the income polarization, the intense demographic shifts that I think are undervalued here. In our elementary school systems in many of our suburban communities, there are a minority group of students moving through the school system, and we will see that increasingly. And given the racial and income disparities associated, it has a lot of implications for how our social systems can respond. So those are the two that we touch on primarily at Metro, I think, that are most relevant. In terms of what will result, I think the interaction of those two forces, unfortunately, will lead to less equitable sort of outcomes unless we are able to outline better approaches.
Can I just pick up on one thing? I completely agree, because you know why? There's a tendency of communities to protect their tax base, which means protect investments. So for a lot of places in the United States, resilience is really a subterfuge for protecting the wealthy, and which is fundamentally protecting the tax base. It's a catch-22 in many ways, and you have to be somewhat sympathetic, but you also have to really fundamentally realize the disproportionate benefit that this has in terms of opportunity cost as well as the primary beneficiaries of that.
I was going to follow up with a thought regarding how certain industry sectors are a path to the middle class, but it is rare. So healthcare is one, but there are only certain types of skill sets that certain individuals have to meet in order to participate in that sector. The construction industry, a little bit more transient. There's not that many other opportunities. There's advanced manufacturing that's changing dramatically. Perhaps there's an opportunity to look at infrastructure itself as a sector and to start to outline a little bit more precisely how we might advance workforce development in tandem with our investments in infrastructure to ensure the middle class receives support in the form of the economic disruption that's coming. I think we've done it before in terms of this, the establishment of the freeways and other things like this. Maybe we can do it in a new format with other forms of infrastructure.
Jeff, apart from that concept of using investment in infrastructure as a job-generating mechanism in and of itself, apart from that, how is Metro thinking about its investments in infrastructure as a path toward increasing equitable outcomes? Because I think I heard you say that was part of what you were trying to figure out, and I'm curious to know where you're headed with that.
I think we're experimenting a lot right now, and I think there's a lot of unknowns that we are trying to work out and work with those with direct connections to the community's workforce and business entrepreneurship amongst priority populations that might not receive the usual support. A lot of it is choices that we're making. I worked on a project with the Brookings Institution called the Economic Value Atlas. Those that were in my lightning session will have been exposed to it. And essentially, it's trying to articulate what's going on, not just comparing our region to other regions, but to look within our community and see, okay, where are the really finite economic injustice issues? Where are the areas where we can leverage dynamic industries, et cetera, to start to build kind of the linkages that might be needed to respond, and then track that alongside the investments we make, and do it every 2 years as a snapshot for now, and then try to, whether it's predictive or just an understanding of the implications of our infrastructure investments on those sort of topical outcomes, then yeah, that's what we're trying to build, I think.
Yeah, makes sense. Reese, what do you have to add to this? Disruptive forces over the next 10 to 20 years.
There's a whole slew of them. So which one to dive in? I think for some reason wastewater treatment plants are on my mind, and it feels like in the 60s and 70s the federal government came in and financed the majority of the cost of wastewater treatment plants all over the Oregon and other states in our country. Huge benefits in terms of public health and the ability to develop. But those are 40 or 50 years long in the tooth now, probably past the original design life. And so is there a ticking time bomb there? Are these plants going to be, especially if what Jesse's saying true, is that the municipal finance is having problems, and this is one of the biggest capital assets that these communities have and need to pay for renewal of, because the federal government is not coming in to pay for the next replacement wastewater treatment plant. So on the positive side, just traveling around Denmark with a bipartisan coalition of state legislators and seeing how they are really looking at wastewater treatment plants as value-generating factories. How do we produce value out of this resource that's flowing through our system, both in electricity, heat, organic fertilizers, products, and we have wastewater treatment plants here that are doing that too. And also looking at specialty chemicals that you could extract out that are much higher value. When you take a barrel of oil, for example, the crude, the bulk of it is the fuel, but that's very low value. And a per volume unit basis, the specialty chemicals, the glues and adhesives and the lipstick and all the other lubricants that you can extract out of that are much higher value. So wastewater treatment plants are beginning to look at their input, taking a variety of organic inputs, not just sewage, but variety of inputs from the community and extracting out maximum value streams. So if we can begin to look at these as value-generating assets, maybe we can make them more economical for our communities.
On that end, you know who else sees value in this, in water systems in the United States, is private equity. And there is a whole investment class of private equity getting into water systems. And there's good and bad experiences. But I'll tell you this. There's a certain city in New Jersey that will go unnamed where they turned it over to a private equity. And it seems good. The numbers seem, it's less upfront money. It's a trade-off, right? But there's people, I guarantee you right now, even this late hour on the East Coast, that are standing in line for bottled water because of the inadequacy of that contract. So I think there's going to be a temptation. There's going to be money, and the money's going to come to you. And the question is, who's really going to pay for that? And I think it's something that we need to have greater clarity on.
Do you have ideas about how we mitigate or protect against that?
I think it's really about more resolute financial planning and engagement. And there's one thing I learned here in my time in the past 2 days is that the state of Oregon is extraordinarily active in managing projects and having, I wouldn't say oversight, but really working to lead that type of financial analysis. And certainly, as I referenced before, your firm and others, really there's a robust set of service providers here that can help support that. But many other places in the country, all the analysis in the world is not necessarily going to overcome the temptations of taking a huge liability off the books. And I think that we need to really think more critically about the contracting, integrating multiple disciplines, including law, participatory and community planning, in multiple facets so that we understand what's really in these types of P3 contracts, because some of them work, but the experience to date has been quite poor.
little worried about going down a rabbit hole, but I'm personally interested in this, so forgive me for this. To me, it seems like there's a really strong connection back to the points that you were making about the current state of fiscal health for many of our communities, and that's definitely true here in the state of Oregon, where we're largely reliant on income tax and property tax to be able to fund any kind of investment. And at the end of the day, if you're talking about public money, it comes back to those two sources. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts collectively up here around what we need to do to be more thoughtful about how we pay for infrastructure. I've heard you all talking about trade-offs and partnerships and private equity, and there's a lot of potential solutions that are floating around in the few words that we've said, but let's get more specific about it. What do we need to do to be able to make these investments in a smart and proactive way?
I think there's a paradox between consumers and taxpayers. You're going to pay for this one way or the other. Yeah. And if it means in Miami-Dade County a 10-fold increase in your water bill so that you can have running water, it's a 10-fold increase, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? So at what point in time do populations exercise their capacity in terms of elective mobility to resettle and move in different places? I mean, it leads to a kind of long-term strategic orientation about population shifts in the capacity of local governments to be, and particularly in high exposure areas, to be fiscally sound and viable, as well as the opportunity in urban areas to have sustainable urban development that operates at scale. And so I'm not sure that there's anything that I could say to that point. And I think you're raising a fundamental question. But at the end of the day, that paradox exists. And the question is operating at this point largely on the margins as to the differential between public and between consumer and taxpayer. And that's just the fact that at the end of the day, you have to have running water. Now, if there's other consumption and other goods like transportation, there's some variability as to what your options are. That's slightly different, but it will, Oregon could urbanize, and it could become much less rural because of the associated costs of what it really costs to live in a rural area.
I think to that end, I think there's a desire by Metro to really understand when we make an investment that what we're getting from it. So if we have employment lands that are, supported by infrastructure investment, and we release that to development, what are we doing it for? Are we going to our zoning is not set up in a way that is effective, or we have the results we want. We might have a mini storage show up where we wanted to have an advanced manufacturing facility. And so I think part of the return on your investment and being smart about at least the expenditure, not the funding side. I have less understanding about that, especially given the downfall in the federal level, being able to resource these investments. But I think it's just really understanding the return on the investment and being more intentional about what we're trying to realize from that investment. And then ultimately, it goes back to some extent to that community support. I mean, if we're ultimately not getting support from the federal government enough to advance these infrastructure projects, we have to deepen our engagement with communities in order to advance their understanding and have us improve our project delivery. But really, their understanding that the resource is not there, and they need to help us, and we need to help them advance it. And then maybe there's a private sector solution as well that I'm less privy to in the philanthropic side of things. It's interesting to see Meyer Memorial Trust experimenting with a real estate investment trust where the resources that are coming in are seeking low return but stable return on an investment portfolio that then is realized in the form of community outcomes for affordable housing or other outcomes that might result. And that being a model for infrastructure investment, it might be interesting to explore.
Well, you guys may have been tracking this over the last few years, but a few years ago when I interviewed the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange folks, Chris Taylor, Scott Boardman, Karen Williams, they really pointed to Partnerships BC, British Columbia, as kind of a state-of-the-art for not P3s, public-private partnerships, but they called it performance-based infrastructure, where the public sector maintains the control of the assets. And they have a center of excellence there which has the procurement expertise to write into contracts performance metrics that private firms, consortiums will compete on to provide the design, build, operate, maintain, and even finance for a public infrastructure project. And they have to meet environmental, social, economic, cost criteria and deliver the asset back to the public at the end of the period of performance, which might be 25 years. So it is the public's asset, and they're required to meet performance metrics defined by the public, economic, social, environmental, and deliver the asset back in good working conditions. So you're not ultimately relinquishing your public asset. You do have to have the ability to pay for it. So if you have a mismatch between the cost of the facility and the population's ability to pay on a monthly basis, you got a problem. But for, in a large enough city or community, and a significant scale of asset, that seemed to be a really kind of a cool model.
And in many other places in the world, many other countries in the world, that model benefits from accelerated depreciation and a tax system which reinforces that asset investment. Which, in theory, we could have.
I think I just heard you saying we need comprehensive tax reform in the state of Oregon. I like that there was at least one person who applauded that. All right, a few more. Very good, very good. Let's see. Let's try to. This was a little bit of a rabbit hole. Thank you for humoring me. Very interesting conversation. I am interested in maybe taking it back up a level and thinking about the biggest barriers that we face to implementing resilient and adaptive infrastructure. What's going to stop us from being successful?
I think Reese has the best answer, at least from today. Just that there's a lot of silos out there, and it extends from the top down to our local communities, and the resources are also disconnected. So the ability to cross those is really challenging to break. And I don't know. I think that's a primary barrier anyway.
Yeah, just reflecting on even this conversation, let alone all of the other sessions, I've heard a lot about the need to be able to show that one investment achieves multiple outcomes. And if you're starting from a place where you've got silos and everyone is fighting for their own piece of the pie, it's much harder to get to that place where you're all working together to try to achieve each other's goals with an investment that works for all of you.
Yeah, to that point, with finance for infrastructure being obviously a huge challenge, if you can craft innovative infrastructure strategies that deliver multiple benefits to multiple parties, can you structure ways of enabling multiple investors to pay for that asset? So you'll have, for example, the Clean Water Services watershed restoration platform that they've developed that has, a couple of dozen co-funding partners who the wastewater treatment plant gets regulatory compliance by investing upstream in watershed restoration that delivers thermal and total suspended solid benefits to the rivers that they're regulatorily required to deliver, but they're able to leverage the investment of fish, people who want to buy the fish benefits, people who want to buy the wildlife benefits, people who want to buy carbon offsets, and a variety of other benefits when there are agencies that are out there that want to buy those certain other collateral kind of benefits. But can you set up a platform that enables multiple investors to invest in that kind of multi-benefit project? Not easy, and I don't know that we have that many examples, so pioneering a new forms of multi-investor cost share financing partnerships would be a barrier. It's kind of a positive opportunity on the flip side. So,
Two sides to every coin. Other thoughts about barriers? Biggest
Well,
barriers
I
to
think,
overcome?
and I'm an outsider to Oregon, but I think that this may resonate here as it does in other states. One of the major challenges, I would say, in the allocation of resources and the advancement of this class of infrastructure is home rule. And home rule getting in the way of a state prerogative. And I
You
think
might have to describe what you mean by that.
home rule is a state constitutional delegation of power and authority to local governments. And this has been a broader trajectory, well, since Thomas Jefferson, of course. But it has been really interpreted and applied in a way that works against let's say, a regional set of problems, because much of the scale of infrastructure is beyond jurisdictional boundaries. The environmental aspects of this are beyond jurisdictional boundaries, and I think some of the probably the most advantageous opportunities are really regionally or sub-regionally, and home rule gets in the way. Home rule gets in the way in terms of bonding capacities and limitations. It gets in the way in probably land use. I would say that probably the single biggest determinant associated with infrastructure investment in the United States is home rule and land use. And frankly, it's hard to get a community to think in their own self-interest over the long term, because there's such a strong incentive for short-term thinking, and that really works against the long-term prerogative of state-level actors. And this is true in really nearly every state in the country. And until you and in fact, I think about Oregon, and I don't know where it stands now, but I think in terms of urban growth boundaries and a distinguished history of thinking in terms of regional governance. And so I think that the ideas and the models are probably here, and this may not even be a problem in Oregon, but I will say in other states, it is the leading challenge in both mitigation investments as well as adaptation investments.
I've got to respond to that with the regionalism
Regional
emphasis.
piece, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have had some recent success in engaging local jurisdictional partners and building it towards major public investments. $652 million towards housing affordability is a huge advance for our region. Similarly, we do the same for parks on a regular basis. We're advancing a transportation measure at a regional basis as well. And then I indeed think that there are some opportunities to kind of recognize local jurisdictions' individual economic needs, but to understand what niche they are filling in the regional economy, for instance, and to help them advance that alongside at a regional scale.
what accounts for the success on that? Is it the Metro's somewhat unique form of regional government and the effectiveness of that, or how do you build that consensus to invest regionally in regional priorities?
I'm a relative newcomer. It's one of, I've only been here about 40.5 years, but I think it's the only regionally elected government body in the U.S.
I mean, from my observation, I live in the Portland metro area, and you've been talking a lot about engagement, and I think Metro did a tremendous job of engaging partners in the process of passing that particular bond measure.
What I will say is we're able to, often a local jurisdiction will say, I'm able to, sort of put my head up and look beyond the day-to-day for a family putting food on their table. Well, similarly, we're able to sort of put our head up and look at a little bit beyond what a local jurisdiction might be doing on a day-to-day basis to operate their city, and also get the revenue they need, to sort of start to outline, okay, but as a region, we want to move in this direction. So I think it's a unique role that I've liked. I get paid to think. It's great.
Yep. So I have good news for all of you. Your session description says that this goes until 5, but it turns out that's a typo, and it goes until 4:30. So we are at the very end of this session, and I would like to conclude with one more quick lightning round. And it is going to have to actually be quick this time, so that we can have some closing remarks and get everyone out of here on time. But This has been a really fascinating discussion. Really appreciate all the themes that we've been exploring. What do we need more of next year? What do you think should be brought forward to the next summit for further conversation and additional exploration? Go ahead.
Well, I think the concept of having infrastructure as its own industry sector is something I would be interested in looking into. Jesse indicates sort of the issues sort of orbiting public-private collaboration and financing of infrastructure in a more direct way, perhaps. And to the infrastructure sectoral comment, I think it would be interesting to see whether there's been instances of tech transfer from, say, some exploration that's happened at a local level that then was expanded and spun off into either a business venture or whatnot, and finding out those ways of engaging the private sector, not just from a reactive standpoint where we put a proposal out, but actually energizing them to sort of get us to understand the creative potential that they have in addressing the issues. Oh, and then health considerations associated with infrastructure is also something that I think is a gap that we could start to look into more.
Yeah, I would reinforce that, and I completely agree. Thinking about an infrastructure sector, thinking about the education, technical education, job training, engaging unions. The fact of the matter is, even if we wanted and had all the money in the world to do everything we wanted, we actually don't have enough people to do it. I just completed a project doing cost estimation, Section 428 in Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands, basically figuring out how we spend about $50 billion down there. The fact of the matter is just simply not enough. I think we all know this is public record. There's simply just not enough people to do the work. This is true in all 50 states. We need job training. We need to help specific product and service development. And there was a number of people here that worked in very specialized production. Oregon could certainly, and Minnesota has done this, other states have done this. Infrastructure, and it's great you're from the sustainable infrastructure thing, because we really haven't talked about the trade-offs between sustainability and adaptation, right? Because a lot of this is in direct conflict with sustainability goals in terms of GHG. And I think when we're looking at cement, concrete production, fabrication work, there's a lot of materials, suppliers, and product development that can be advantaged by intellectual property, that can think about commercialization of IP, that can actually transition into products and services. And I think you have an opportunity to lead here, and certainly that's the legacy in Oregon.
Cool. 30 seconds, Reese.
Ooh, well, I love both those. I guess who's doing the coolest stuff, the most exciting stuff in Oregon around dovetailing economic development with infrastructure strategy? I would love to see that, and I would love to, I guess I'm channeling Bobby Cochran here, but to your point, explore the opportunities to advance health through infrastructure strategy. In particular, I love Bobby's idea of a community-centered utility and what that means. So I've become a huge fan of utilities, which seems weird, but I think there are one of our few vehicles to marshal capital together for assets that we own and use and invest in together. So what does a community-centric utility mean?
Good question to leave us with. I think that's it for today. Thank you all so much for sticking through to the end. I know Kim wants to close it down, but thank you to the speakers.
Thanks, Lorelei.
Appreciate your time and energy.
So I just wanted to thank our speakers for being here. Thank you, and everyone else, all of our speakers for the rest of the day. It took a lot of your time and energy to be here, and we all definitely benefit from that. So thank you again to our speakers. I also want to thank our organizing committee, who I think we've already thanked, but if you haven't already looked, the list of tremendous number of people who helped put this together are in the brochure. Please, when you see them, thank them. I want to thank you. I want to thank our summit partners, which is us, Business Oregon, so that was great that we were able to do this. Really grateful that our administration let us do that. And to the Northwest Environmental Business Council, a lot of work went into making this happen, so again, thanks to all of them. I want to thank our students and our staff support. So we had student note takers and staff note takers in every session. The intent is to have some follow-up summary materials that serves as a fantastic resource for everybody, so keep your eye open for that, and we'll be very grateful when we get that. Thanks to some Willamette business or economic students and MBA from U of O, so that's fantastic. And I just wanted to let people know that they should keep an eye out for some follow-up materials. There'll be the event summary that I mentioned. We'll have all the PowerPoints available, so no need to freak out about that. We'll be having a survey go around to let us know how we can do better next year, and then look for a save the date for next year in Bend in October. And with that, thank you.